There are bloodlines that never cool, beneath the sands of centuries, where wind has forgotten its own name. The voices of kings still whisper. They speak not to be heard, but to be remembered. They feared death more than war, more than gods, and so they made tombs as large as mountains, hoping stone could deceive eternity. But every stone remembers what it buries, and every echo in the dark is a promise or a curse. Welcome to Mr.Sleepless channel, and I'm Owlman. Tonight we drift into the deep mist of an older world in the 7-part series, The Haunted Empires. These are not tales of glory. They are laments carved into silence. The mummy who swore vengeance to the sands. The black lotus that bloomed from poison and pride. The queen who defied the sun and vanished in its fire. The desert that still echoes with footsteps of those who never found rest. 4 stories, 1 bloodline, bound by time, broken by immortality. Listen closely, for the sand still remembers, and tonight, it remembers you. If these voices reach you, if the dust of these tales stirs something ancient within, then let your mark be seen. Leave a light, a like, so the story may live longer than silence. Subscribe if you wish to walk with us again beneath the desert stars. And tell me, where in this vast world do you now hear the whispers of the pharaohs? What time is it, where you are, as this story awakens in the dark? You stand at the threshold where sand meets shadow, where the air itself tastes of myrrh and something older, something that has no name in the languages of the living. The year is 1323 BCE, though such numbers mean nothing here, in this place where time moves like honey through cracked glass. Before you, carved into limestone that will outlast empires, a name, Khaemweset, the forgotten pharaoh. He who wore the double crown for precisely 11 months before the priests erased him from every cartouche, every papyrus, every whispered prayer. History, you see, is written by those who survive their own ambitions. But you are not here for history. You are here for the story beneath it. The king, for he was still a king, despite what came after, did not fear death the way ordinary men do. No, his terror was far more exquisite than that. He feared silence, the absolute crushing silence of being forgotten. In the great temple of Karnak, where the air shimmers with incense and the blood of 1,000 sacrifices has stained the altar black, he stood before the high priest Imhotep the Younger and spoke words that would crack the foundations of Ma'at itself. I will not fade. I will not dissolve into the breath of Ra. When my body fails, let my oath remain. Let it walk, let it remember, let it take. You watch him now, this god-king with coal-lined eyes and hands trembling beneath the weight of his golden crook and flail. The priests believed that proper mummification, the 70 days of natron salts, the careful removal of organs, the wrapping in linen blessed by Anubis, could preserve a soul for its journey through the Duat. But Khaemweset wanted something the priests could not give. He wanted his will to survive independent of the gods themselves. Some scholars argue that his obsession stemmed from witnessing his predecessor's tomb robbed within a year of burial, that he understood, with brutal clarity, that even the most elaborate afterlife could be interrupted by a chisel and greed. Others whisper of a darker catalyst, a dream in which he saw himself dissolved into nothing, not even worthy of the Eater of Hearts. The ritual he demanded was not in any approved book of the dead. It required something the official priesthood would never sanction, a binding not to the gods, but to the land itself. In the valley where the sun dies each evening, where the cliffs glow red like opened wounds, Khamwaset had his architects carve a tomb that breathed. You can see it taking shape before you, not merely chambers and corridors, but a living labyrinth designed with intentional asymmetry. The ancient Egyptians, master geometers who aligned their monuments to celestial perfection, built this one wrong on purpose. The entrance faces south instead of west. The burial chamber sits not at the center, but skewed 17 degrees off-axis. Every angle deliberately disrupts the eye, the mind, the soul's natural navigation. This architectural blasphemy had a singular purpose: to trap not the body, but the oath itself within the stones. On the night of the binding, and this is where fringe texts like the apocryphal papyrus of forgotten names diverge from mainstream Egyptology, Khamwaset entered his own tomb while still alive. 7 priests accompanied him, each carrying a canopic jar, though these jars contained nothing yet. The ritual required him to place 1 drop of his living blood into each jar while speaking his vow to the sand, the stone, the eternal desert wind. I am Khamwaset, beloved of no god, father of no heir, ruler of a land that will erase me. But I swear this: I will return, not as spirit, not as shadow, but as consequence. My vengeance will be the price of my silence. Touch what is mine, and you touch eternity's throat. The priests, understanding too late what they had enabled, tried to seal the tomb with him inside. But here is where history fractures into myth. Some say Khamwaset emerged 3 days later, pale as limestone, speaking in a voice that no longer sounded entirely human. Others claim he never left at all, that what walked out of that tomb was merely the first manifestation of what he'd become. The official record, carved by his successor Ramses IV, simply states that Khamwaset departed to the west in the manner of traitors, a phrase that meant his name was to be struck from existence. But you cannot strike an oath from sand. You feel it now, don't you? The way the air in this tomb moves against the natural order, flowing inward instead of out, as if the chamber itself is breathing, drawing sustenance from the darkness. The walls are covered in hieroglyphs that hurt to read, not because they're damaged, but because they're wrong. They show Khamwaset not standing before Osiris in judgment, but standing beside him, equal in height, equal in authority. In one image, the pharaoh's hand rests on the scales where hearts are weighed, his finger tilting the balance. This was heresy so profound that it should have been chiseled away by horrified priests. Yet it remains. The 7 canopic jars still sit in their alcove, untouched by 33 centuries. They should be empty. The organs they were meant to hold would have long since turned to dust. But if you listen closely, you can hear something shifting inside them. A whisper, a promise, a clock wound by fury, ticking backward toward the moment of its release. Khamwaset's mummy was never found. Archaeologists discovered the tomb in 1897, looted in antiquity, but structurally intact. The sarcophagus lay open, its lid cracked but not removed. Inside, nothing. Not even the residue of linen wrappings, just a fine layer of sand that, when disturbed, briefly held the shape of a body before collapsing. The expedition leader, one Theodore Banning, noted in his journal that the sand was peculiarly warm, as if heated from within, though no explanation presents itself. He died 3 weeks later. Cause of death: spontaneous mummification of his internal organs while still living. But that comes later. That is the walking part of the oath. For now you stand in this breathing tomb, feeling the weight of a promise made to no God, bound by no divine law, accountable only to rage and the refusal to be forgotten. The sand remembers. The stone remembers. And in the spaces between heartbeats, you begin to understand. Khaemwaset didn't curse his tomb. He became it. You blink, and 3,000 years pass like smoke through fingers. The tomb does not age the way tombs should, stone eroding grain by grain, paint flaking into memory, certainty crumbling into archaeological debate. No, this place exists in a pocket of time that refuses to move forward, a bubble of perpetual midnight, where Khaemwaset's final breath still hangs in the air, waiting to be exhaled. The desert above has shifted, empires rising and falling like waves against an indifferent shore. The Ptolemies, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the British with their measured arrogance and cataloging obsessions. Each civilization touches Egypt and thinks itself the first to truly understand her secrets. Each one is wrong in precisely the same way. But the sand remembers everything, and it keeps meticulous records. You walk now through the centuries, watching as tomb robbers come and go. First, the desperate locals in the years immediately following Khaemwaset's disappearance. Then the organized gangs during the decline of the New Kingdom, when even royal necropolises were treated as quarries for resale gold. They enter his tomb with torches and greed, expecting the usual treasures: golden masks, jeweled collars, the furniture of eternity rendered in precious metals. Instead, they find the 7 jars, the wrong-angled walls, the hieroglyphs that seem to shift when viewed peripherally. Most leave quickly, spooked by instinct older than language. A few stay longer, drawn by the peculiar warmth emanating from those sealed vessels, the sense that something valuable, something powerful, waits just beyond comprehension. Those few never leave at all. Not in any way that matters. The historical record is sparse but suggestive. During the Third Intermediate Period, around 1070 BCE, a royal commission investigated reports of the tomb that devours men in the Valley of the Lost. They sealed it with rubble and priestly warnings, declaring the site cursed by Set himself, though privately the priests knew better. Set was chaos, yes, but he was divine chaos, part of the cosmic order. What dwelt in Khaemwaset's tomb answered to no pantheon. The lead investigator, a priest named Herihor, recorded in his private journal, a journal discovered in a secondary tomb in 1923, that he heard his own name whispered from within the sealed chamber, spoken in a voice he recognized. His father's, dead for 20 years. "The dead do not speak," he wrote. "But the oath does, and it knows the shape of every grief." Scholars debate whether Herihor's journal represents genuine supernatural experience or the psychological strain of his political position during Egypt's fracturing. You, standing in this liminal space between then and now, know that some questions contain their own answers. The centuries roll past, and you notice something peculiar. The tomb develops a rhythm, a pattern of awakening, every generation or so. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3, someone finds it again despite the seals, despite the warnings, despite the desert's best efforts to bury it beneath dunes. It's as if the tomb allows itself to be discovered, as if it requires periodic contact with the living to maintain its connection to the world of consequence. In 850 CE, an Arab geographer named al-Mas'udi documented the breathing cave of forgotten kings in his Meadows of Gold, describing how the entrance exhaled warm air at sunset and inhaled cool air at dawn. He collected samples of the sand from within, sand that retained body heat for hours after removal, sand that, when scattered, slowly crept back together into a pile over the course of 3 days. His samples vanished from the caliph's treasury within a month. The guards reported that the container simply became empty overnight, though it remained sealed. They also reported dreams, a figure wrapped in linen, standing at the foot of their beds, watching with eyeless patience. You're beginning to understand the mechanism now, aren't you? Khemweset's oath wasn't a simple curse, not the disturb my rest and suffer formula that Egyptologists love to sensationalize. It was something far more elegant and terrible, a contract with inevitability itself. Every person who entered his tomb became a thread in the larger weaving of his return, a tiny deposit in the bank of attention he needed to maintain his existence against the universe's tendency toward forgetting. He wasn't killing them, not exactly. He was using them as anchors, tethering himself to the continuous stream of human consciousness. The fringe occultists, the ones mainstream academia dismisses as romantically deluded, might have gotten closer to the truth than they're credited for. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, in their 1888 treatise on Egyptian magical practice, proposed that certain pharaohs discovered a form of immortality that didn't depend on the gods or the afterlife machinery the priests maintained. Instead, these rulers bound themselves to human memory itself, to the collective unconscious that Jung would later try to map. Every thought about them, every fear they inspired, every story told became sustenance. Khemweset simply refined the technique. Rather than relying on fame or historical record, he created a need to remember him, a compulsion encoded in the very atoms of his tomb. By the time Napoleon's savants arrived in Egypt in 1798, cataloging monuments with Enlightenment fervor, Khemweset's tomb had been sealed and forgotten again, or so the official documents claimed. But in the personal correspondence of Jean-François Champollion, the man who would crack the hieroglyphic code, there's a curious reference to the tomb that should not be mapped, described to him by a local guide in 1828. The guide warned that cartographers who attempted to include it in their surveys inevitably produced maps with errors, distances that didn't match, compass readings that shifted. Champollion, ever the rationalist, attributed this to magnetic anomalies in the stone. Yet he also noted, almost as an afterthought, that he dreamed of the tomb for 7 nights running after that conversation. Dreams in which he stood before a sealed sarcophagus and heard someone counting backward from infinity. The 20th century arrived with its electric lights and rational certainties, and the tomb allowed itself to be found once more. Theodore Banning's expedition in 1897, mentioned before, opened the chamber with great ceremony and scientific procedure. They photographed everything, catalogued every artifact, sent detailed reports back to the British Museum. The photographs are fascinating. In some shots, the hieroglyphs appear perfectly clear, In others, taken moments later from the same angle, they're blurred as if by motion. Banning's team spent 6 days inside, measuring and recording. On the 7th day, Banning woke unable to breathe. His lungs had somehow dried out overnight, the tissue becoming brittle and desiccated while he slept. The camp physician documented his death as spontaneous mummification of respiratory organs, etiology unknown. 2 other team members died within the month, one from sudden dehydration despite drinking copious amounts of water. Another from what the autopsy described as complete absence of moisture in all soft tissues. The tomb was sealed again, this time with concrete and bureaucratic indifference. The area was declared archaeologically exhausted and dropped from survey maps. But you know better. You can feel it, can't you? The way the oath continues to tick forward, counting down to the moment when it will finally wake fully, when Kamwaset's vengeance will no longer need to wait for visitors to stumble into his trap. The sand has been patient. The stone has been faithful. And somewhere in the spaces between documented history and suppressed accounts, the forgotten pharaoh's will has been growing stronger, fed by every skeptic who dismisses the pattern, every rationalist who explains away the deaths, every scholar who strikes his name from their indices. Time forgets nothing. It merely pretends to as a courtesy. You arrive at the present moment. Your moment. This October night in 2025 when the world believes itself immune to ancient promises. The desert stretches before you, illuminated not by torchlight or oil lamp but by the cold glow of LED work lights. The kind that turns shadows into hard-edged things without mystery. A new expedition has arrived, funded by a tech billionaire with too much money and not enough reverence, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and 3D mapping software, and the unshakable conviction that technology can sanitize even the most dangerous truths. They've found Kamwaset's tomb again, and really, how could they not? It wanted to be found. It's been 3 generations since the last awakening, and the oath grows hungry. Dr. Sarah Chen leads the team, a brilliant Egyptologist from Berkeley with 17 peer-reviewed publications and a reputation for debunking curses with thermodynamics and statistics. You watch her brief her crew outside the entrance, her voice crisp with confidence. The so-called curse is simple probability. Banning's team died from diseases common to excavation sites in 1897. No mystery, just poor hygiene and pre-antibiotic medicine. We're not here to feed superstition. We're here to recover a lost pharaoh for history. Her team nods, reassured by her certainty. They wear hazmat suits against fungal spores and carry air quality monitors. They've thought of everything except the one thing that matters. Inside, the tomb breathes its welcome. The 7 canopic jars still sit in their alcove, and now you can see what fills them. Not organs, never organs. Each jar contains sand, yes, but sand that moves in spirals, miniature whirlwinds trapped in clay, eternally circling. Dr. Chen photographs them, her camera's flash freezing the motion for 1/60th of a second. In that frozen moment, if you look closely at the image later, you'll see shapes in the sand. Faces, hands, the silhouettes of everyone who ever entered this chamber and never truly left. The camera sees what the eye refuses to acknowledge. "Temperature's spiking," calls out James, the team's environmental tech, staring at his monitor with growing concern. It's reading 38 degrees Celsius in here, but that's impossible. We're 15 meters underground with no heat source. Dr. Chen dismisses it. Thermal layering, equipment malfunction, the usual suspects of rational explanation. But you know better. The tomb has begun to wake in earnest, and warmth is merely memory made physical. The memory of a living king's fury, preserved in stone and promise. Remember the whisper that began it all, Khaemwaset's vow to the sand itself. That oath has been patient for 33 centuries, fed by every intrusion, every skeptic, every scholar who thought themselves above ancient warnings. The curse, if we must call it that, though the word is far too simple, was never about defending treasure or maintaining rest. It was about continuation. Khaemwaset understood what modern psychology would later articulate. Identity requires witness. To exist, one must be perceived, remembered, acknowledged. He couldn't trust the gods for this service, couldn't trust priests or descendants or the fragile machinery of historical record. So he bound himself to something more reliable, human curiosity itself, that ineradicable impulse to uncover, to know, to touch what should remain untouched. The team works through the night, cataloging artifacts with digital precision. They find the empty sarcophagus and dismiss its emptiness as evidence of ancient robbery. Never mind that tomb robbers take things, not bodies, and certainly not the wrappings those bodies wore. They measure the wrong angles in the architecture and attribute them to settlement shifts or construction errors. Never mind that Egyptian engineers could align monuments to stellar positions with staggering accuracy. Every anomaly receives its rational footnote, its comfortable explanation that preserves the wall between then and now. But walls, you're learning, are far more permeable than we pretend. At 3:47 a.m., always the witching hours, when human consciousness dips lowest, Dr. Chen notices something odd about the hieroglyphs she's been photographing. They're changing. Not dramatically, not in any way her colleagues would notice. But the cartouche that should contain Khaemwaset's name now contains hers. Her name, rendered in phonetic hieroglyphs, inserted into texts written 3 millennia before her birth. She blinks, looks again. It's gone, returned to normal. A trick of exhaustion, she tells herself. The mind playing games after 16 hours underground. She doesn't mention it to the others. This is her first mistake. The second mistake comes when James, curious and young and convinced that scientific equipment can measure anything, opens one of the canopic jars. Just slightly, just enough to insert a fiber optic camera and photograph the contents. The seal breaks with a sound like indrawn breath, and the sand inside stops its spiraling. For 3 heartbeats, everything in the tomb goes perfectly still. No air movement, no ambient sound, that pregnant pause before the thunder arrives. Then the sand pours out, not falling but rising, defying gravity in a stream that flows upward and outward, dispersing into air that shouldn't hold it. James breathes it in. Of course he does. He's only human, and humans must breathe. The sand enters him, and his eyes go wide with something that might be recognition, or might be terror, or might be both fused into a single understanding. When he speaks, his voice carries harmonics it shouldn't possess, layers of sound like multiple speakers occupying the same throat. I am Khaemwaset, beloved of no god, father of no heir, I swore to the sands. The sands remember. You have come as I knew you would. You always come. Dr. Chen backs away, her rational framework cracking like sun-baked clay. The others cluster around James, trying to help, not understanding that help is no longer a relevant concept. He's smiling now, and it's not entirely his smile anymore. It's older, colder, edged with satisfaction that has waited epochs for this precise moment. The oath doesn't possess in the crude supernatural sense. It doesn't evict the soul to install another. Instead, it adds. James is still present, but now he shares his existence with something that has been practicing patience longer than Islam has existed, longer than Rome rose and fell, longer than anyone living can truly comprehend. This is contamination, Dr. Chen says, her voice tight with the need for normalcy. Hallucinogenic fungal spores. We need to evacuate. But even as she speaks, she feels it. The warmth spreading through the chamber, the sense of attention focusing upon them all. The tomb isn't just a place anymore. It's an entity. A consciousness constructed from vengeance and memory and the accumulated weight of every fear that ever echoed through these corridors. The other jars begin to crack, hairline fractures spreading across clay that has remained intact for millennia. 6 more streams of sand will rise. 6 more anchors for an oath that's finally ready to walk in the world again, no longer content to wait for victims to stumble into its domain. Khaemwaset's understanding was profound. He didn't need to preserve his body. Bodies decay, bones crumble, even gold tarnishes. But oaths sworn to elemental forces, fed by human consciousness, given shape by architectural intention, those can grow stronger with age, like wine becoming poison in ancient amphorae. You stand at the threshold now, watching as the modern world collides with a promise made when the modern world was unimaginable. Dr. Chen will escape, though she'll never publish her findings, never speak publicly of what she witnessed. She'll leave Egyptology entirely, becoming an accountant in Toronto, choosing numbers that always behave predictably over histories that refuse to stay buried. The others, well, their fate becomes part of the pattern, another cycle in the rhythm of awakening and feeding that Khaemwaset designed. But here's what the news reports won't tell you. What the official investigations will carefully avoid. James and the others don't die. They walk out of that tomb 3 days later, alive and seemingly unharmed. They return to their lives, their families, their ordinary routines. Except on certain nights when the moon sits just so, when the wind blows from the south, when the anniversary of their descent aligns with celestial patterns, they stop what they're doing and turn toward the east, toward the desert that birthed this curse. And they speak, in voices not entirely their own, words in a language 13 centuries dead. I am not forgotten. I am consequence. Touch what is mine, and you touch eternity's throat. The oath walks now, distributed across vessels of flesh and breath, no longer confined to stone and sand. Khaemwaset has achieved his immortality, not the paradise the priests promised, not the judgment hall of Osiris, but something stranger and more terrible. He exists as a pattern, a virus of consciousness that propagates through curiosity itself. Every person who learns his story, who reads these words, who wonders if perhaps there's truth beneath the myth, each becomes a potential vessel, a place where his will might briefly flower. Even death, you see, has learned to fear certain promises, and the desert, the eternal desert that witnesses all human vanity, keeps perfect records of who swore what to whom, and when those debts come due. The sand remembers everything. The stone stands witness, and somewhere between your heartbeat and the next, you realize you've been breathing the same air that flowed through that tomb, thinking thoughts that might not be entirely your own, speaking a name that was meant to be forgotten but refuses eternally to die. Kaimuaset smiles through 1,000 sleeping faces, and the oath, patient, vast, inevitable, continues its count backward toward zero. You stand in the royal gardens of Thebes, where the Nile's breath rises like prayer at dawn, where lotus flowers, white, blue, pink, open their faces to Ra's first light with the devotion of supplicants who know their god by name. The year is 1334 BCE, and you are watching a woman who has forgotten how to weep properly. Her name is Nefertari, though not the Nefertari. History will forget this one, will let her slip through the cracks between dynasties like water through fingers. She is the lesser wife of Pharaoh I, the old man who seized the throne after Tutankhamun's convenient death, and she has just buried her only son in the Valley of the Nobles, in a tomb too small for the grief it must contain. The priests have told her that grief is unseemly in the presence of divine kingship, that death is merely transition, that the soul of her boy, sweet Ahmose, who loved birds and could name 17 species by their songs alone, has already begun its journey through the Duat, weighing his heart against Ma'at's feather, speaking the negative confessions, becoming eternal. The priests say these things with practiced compassion, and they believe none of it matters beyond its utility in keeping the living compliant. You see, institutional religion has always understood that comfort and control are cousins, distinguished only by intention. But Nefertari does not want comfort. She wants reversal. In the garden, she kneels beside the sacred pool where blue lotus flowers drift like small boats navigating an infinite ocean. The Egyptians used these flowers for everything: religious ceremonies, medicinal preparations, recreational intoxication. The petals, when steeped in wine, produced mild euphoria and vivid dreams. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows that even common laborers had access to lotus wine, a democratic narcotic that softened the edges of lives spent dragging stones across sand. But Nefertari is not interested in softening. She has brought something else to mix with the lotus roots she tears from the mud: poison. Specifically, the extracted essence of Nerium oleander, the beautiful killer that grows along the Nile's banks with flowers like pink stars and sap that stops hearts with chemical precision. Some scholars argue that oleander poisoning was the favored method of political assassination during the New Kingdom. Impossible to detect post-mortem with the tools available, easily disguised in food or wine, producing symptoms that mimicked natural heart failure. Others contend this gives ancient poisoners too much credit, that most deaths attributed to conspiracy were merely the statistically inevitable result of poor sanitation and shorter lifespans. You, watching Nefertari's hands work with feverish precision, know that conspiracy and coincidence often share the same hands. She speaks as she works, and her words are not prayer, not to any god who would listen anyway. If death cannot be undone, she whispers to the soil, to the roots, to the patient earth that receives all bodies eventually. Then let it at least be marked. Let something bloom from this grief that refuses to be forgotten. Let poison and beauty grow together, inseparable, so that anyone who reaches for one receives both. Her tears fall into the mixture of lotus root and oleander sap, salt water joining plant blood in a marriage of sorrow and venom. What happens next depends on whether you believe in the literal or the symbolic, and the space between those two territories is narrower than rational minds prefer to admit. Nefertari plants her mixture, this hybridized abomination of sacred flower and secular poison, in the darkest corner of the royal garden, where the palace walls cast perpetual shadow, where even at noon the sun cannot quite reach. She speaks words that are not in any approved liturgy, syllables that sound almost Nubian, almost Mesopotamian, almost like no human language at all. And then she waits. 3 nights pass. On the 4th morning, the gardeners discover something that should not exist. A lotus flower of absolute black, its petals the color of obsidian or pupil or the space between stars. It grows on a single stem, thorned like a rose, and lotus stems do not have thorns, cannot have thorns, are smooth as papyrus reeds. Yet here it grows, defiant of botanical classification, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. The head gardener, an old man named Ptahhotep, who has maintained these grounds for 3 pharaohs, knows immediately that this is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of surprising or unusual, but wrong in the fundamental way that a chord played out of key is wrong. It creates dissonance in the fabric of order itself. He moves to pull it up, to destroy this aberration before it can be seen by anyone important. But when his hand closes around the thorned stem, he feels something travel up his arm, not pain, not exactly, but knowledge. He sees, in a flash more vivid than memory, the death of his own daughter 30 years prior, fever, convulsions, the small body going rigid in his arms. He has spent 3 decades learning not to think about it. The black lotus makes him remember everything in perfect, crystalline, unbearable detail. He releases the stem and backs away, his hand bleeding from puncture wounds that look disturbingly like the marks of ritual scarification. The flower remains, swaying slightly though no wind blows, its black petals catching light in ways that black should not. Iridescent, rainbow-sheened, like oil on water or the wings of certain beetles that ancient Egyptians ground into powder for eye makeup. Word reaches Nefertari, and she comes to see what her grief has birthed. When she looks upon the black lotus, she smiles for the first time since her son's death, a smile that would frighten anyone who truly understood what it signified. She does not touch the flower. She does not need to. It exists, and that existence is vindication. Grief, you see, demands witnesses. It demands monuments, and if the monuments must be monstrous to match the size of the loss, then so be it. Pharaoh A, old and tired and aware that his reign is a transitional footnote between more important chapters, hears about the black lotus and dismisses it as garden curiosity. He has larger concerns, legitimizing his rule, managing the priesthood of Amun, navigating the political chaos that followed Akhenaten's monotheistic catastrophe. A strange flower seems, in comparison, trivially irrelevant. This is his first mistake, though he will not live long enough to realize it. Old men who seize thrones rarely do. But Nefertari knows what she has created, even if she cannot yet name it fully. She has taken the symbol of rebirth and resurrection, the lotus that closes at night and opens at dawn, that represents the sun's daily victory over darkness, and she has inverted it. This flower blooms at midnight. This flower opens its petals to the moon, not the sun. And this flower does not promise resurrection. It promises remembrance, at the cost of everything else. You move forward through time like a stone skipping across water, touching down at moments when the black lotus makes itself known, when its presence ripples outward through the dynasty that thought itself immune to consequences. Pharaoh A dies within the year. Peacefully, the official reports claim, in his sleep, surrounded by the appropriate rituals and prayers. But his body, when prepared for mummification, presents the embalmers with a curiosity. His heart has turned black, not with decay, but with something that resembles crystallization, as if the organ had been replaced with polished stone. The chief embalmer, a man who has seen every variation of death that flesh permits, makes no official note of this anomaly. He simply removes the heart as tradition requires and places it in its canopic jar, sealing away the evidence of something he has no framework to explain. The throne passes to Horemheb, the general who has been waiting with military patience for his moment. He is everything I was not. Vigorous, strategic, ruthless in the precise way that successful rulers must be. He takes Nefertari as one of his lesser wives, not for love, certainly not for that, but because political consolidation requires absorbing the previous regime's remnants, neutralizing potential opposition through marriage rather than execution. It's more elegant that way, more civilized. Horemheb prides himself on elegance. Nefertari brings nothing to the marriage but a single possession, a cutting from the black lotus now growing in a clay pot that she keeps in her private chambers. Horemheb sees it once and finds it distasteful, unnatural, he says, like something that crawled up from the underworld. "Destroy it," he commands with the casual authority of a man accustomed to obedience. Nefertari smiles that smile again, the one that should serve as warning, and agrees. Of course she agrees. She is a widow, twice over now, without power or protection beyond her husband's whim. What choice does she have? But you've learned by now, that agreements and obedience occupy different territories entirely. The black lotus remains, hidden but growing, its roots somehow extending beyond the clay pot, seeking purchase in the limestone floor itself. Impossible, yes, but the impossible has a way of occurring when belief and grief achieve sufficient density. In the fringe texts of Hermetic tradition, those manuscripts that mainstream Egyptology treats with academic embarrassment, there are references to flowers of crossed purpose that grow at the intersection of desire and death, plants that feed not on soil and sun, but on human emotion made manifest. The medieval alchemists were obsessed with these botanical impossibilities, seeking to recreate them in their laboratories, convinced that such plants held the secret to the philosopher's stone. They failed, of course. You cannot cultivate what was never meant to be cultivated. The black lotus does not obey horticultural law. It obeys only the original intention planted into its roots. Mark the fall. Remember the grief. make beauty and poison inseparable. Strange things begin to happen in Horemheb's court. Minor at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or courtly intrigue, which are often indistinguishable anyway. Officials who speak against Nefertari in council find themselves plagued by dreams of their own dead children, dead parents, dead lovers, grief they thought they had successfully buried rising like floodwater to drown their waking hours. A high priest who suggests that Nefertari's influence is unwholesome develops a mysterious affliction. Every lotus flower he touches, white, blue, pink, withers instantly, blackening as if exposed to flame. He is relieved of his duties, quietly, before the symbolism becomes too obvious for the people to ignore. Horemheb, who has survived decades of military campaigns and political machinations, begins to understand that something is wrong. Not wrong in the way battles are lost or alliances fail, but wrong in the fundamental architecture of reality around him. He orders his personal guards to search Nefertari's chambers. They find the black lotus, now bloomed into 7 flowers on a single impossible stem, each petal darker than shadow, each thorn sharp as obsidian flakes. The guards, wearing gloves, attempt to remove it. The pot shatters in their hands, and the roots, exposed now, visible, are not roots at all, but something that resembles human hair, black and thick and disturbingly animate. The plant has been feeding on the palace itself, drawing sustenance from the limestone that ancient hands quarried and shaped, from the history soaked into every stone. One guard screams. Not from pain, the plant hasn't touched him, but from sudden, overwhelming memory. He sees his brother's death in battle, the spear entering between ribs, the specific sound of breath leaving a body for the final time. He has carried this memory for 12 years, has learned to function around it. Now it fills his entire consciousness, fresh as yesterday, sharp as if he's watching it happen again in this very moment. The other guards drag him away. The black lotus remains, roots spread across the chamber floor like a network of veins, pulsing with something that might be growth or might be hunger or might be both. Horemheb confronts Nefertari that evening, and here the historical record fractures into competing narratives. Some sources, primarily those sympathetic to Horemheb's legacy, claim he had her executed for sorcery, that her death was swift and merciful given the nature of her crimes. Other texts, the ones tucked away in temple archives and discovered centuries later by monks who copied them without quite understanding what they transcribed, tell a different story. That Horemheb begged her to stop whatever she had started, offered her position and wealth and freedom, anything to end the plague of grief that was spreading through his court like spiritual contagion. "I cannot stop it," she tells him, and her voice carries the serenity of someone who has already won, even if victory looks like mutual destruction. "I planted grief, and grief does not have seasons. It does not know when to stop blooming. You wanted a dynasty, Pharaoh? I have given you one. A dynasty of remembrance, where every death that built your throne refuses to be forgotten." That night, Horemheb dreams of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose death cleared the path for whose death ultimately enabled Horemheb's own ascension. In the dream, Tutankhamun is not accusing or angry. He simply stands in a garden full of black lotuses, waiting, patient as stone. When Horemheb wakes, he finds a single black petal on his pillow. No one can explain how it entered his locked chamber, guarded by soldiers he trusts with his life. The dynasty begins to crumble, not through military defeat or economic collapse, those endings at least have dignity, but through something far more insidious: the inability to forget. Officials become paralyzed by memories of every compromise they made to achieve power, every betrayal, every small death of conscience. The palace becomes populated by haunted men performing the rituals of governance while drowning internally in the accumulated weight of their own histories. Horemheb tries to maintain order through force of will, but will, even pharaonic will, cannot compete with a grief that has learned to propagate itself. Nefertari disappears from the record entirely after this point. Some say Horemheb had her killed, and her name struck from every surface, though no execution order survives. Others whisper that she simply walked out of the palace one dawn and was never seen again, leaving only the black lotus behind, still growing, still blooming, still marking the space where a dynasty learned that some griefs refuse domestication. The flower, though, the flower remembers everything. And it continues to grow in the dark corners where official history prefers not to look. You arrive at the moment when myth calcifies into history, when the Black Lotus becomes something scholars debate in footnotes while carefully avoiding its implications. Horemheb dies in 1292 BCE, having ruled for 27 years that felt, to those who lived through them, like centuries measured in slow erosion. His successor, Ramses III, inherits a stable kingdom on the surface, temples repaired, monuments restored, the chaos of the Amarna period seemingly buried beneath fresh propaganda and strategic amnesia. But he also inherits something the official records omit: a garden where nothing wholesome grows anymore, where the black lotus has spread like beautiful cancer through the soil, its roots reaching deep into the foundation stones of the palace itself. Ramesses, pragmatic and old, he's nearly 60 when he takes the throne. A general elevated by circumstance rather than divine birthright, orders the garden destroyed. Not pruned or redesigned, but obliterated. His workers dig down 6 feet, removing every plant, every root system, every handful of contaminated soil. They replace it with fresh earth brought from across the Nile, blessed by priests of Amun, sanctified with rituals meant to purify spaces where unwholesome things have taken root. The black lotus, dug up with its impossible hair-like roots still writhing faintly, is burned in a bronze brazier while priests chant protective formulas. The ashes are sealed in a jar and buried in the desert, far from the Nile's life-giving presence, in a place so remote that even tomb robbers would find it more trouble than reward. This should end the story. This is where rational narratives conclude. Problem identified, problem solved, dynasty moves forward into the glorious reign of Ramses II, the great builder, the pharaoh who will leave his name carved on more monuments than any other. The Black Lotus becomes, at best, a curious anecdote whispered between priests, a cautionary tale about grief allowed to fester into something unnatural. History, after all, prefers clean arcs and tidy resolutions. But remember what was planted in that first moment of creation. Let something bloom from this grief that refuses to be forgotten. And oaths, once spoken to soil and shadow, do not honor the preferences of historians. The Black Lotus returns, not immediately. These things understand patience better than humans ever could. 20 years pass. 50, a century. The garden above its burial site remains stubbornly barren despite the blessed soil, the prayers, the increasingly desperate attempts to make things grow there. Ramses II, in his long and monument-studded reign, builds a new palace complex at Pi Ramesses and abandons the Theban palace entirely. He tells his architects it's for strategic reasons, closer to the delta, better positioned to monitor the northern territories, more efficient for military campaigns. But his private journals, discovered in fragmentary form during excavations in 1927, reveal a different motivation. The old palace dreams too loudly. I wake hearing names I have never known, grieving for losses that are not mine. Let the gods keep Thebes. I will build where the ground does not remember. The abandoned palace at Thebes falls into disrepair, occupied occasionally by lesser officials, minor priests, administrative functionaries who cannot afford better accommodations. They report, in letters and diary fragments, that archaeologists treat as interesting but unreliable, that the garden grows things at night that vanish by morning. Black flowers that leave no trace except a faint scent like myrrh mixed with something chemical, something that should not occur in nature. Modern botanists, when presented with these descriptions, dismiss them as probably referring to Taka chantrieri, the black bat flower native to Southeast Asia, its presence in Egypt explained by ancient trade routes. But trade routes do not explain flowers that bloom only in moonlight and wither before dawn, leaving behind thorns embedded in stone. You're watching now as centuries collapse like a concertina, each fold bringing you closer to the present moment. The palace crumbles. Dynasties rise and fall with the regularity of tides. The Ptolemies arrive, Greek speakers who crown themselves pharaohs and adopt Egyptian religious iconography without quite understanding what they're performing. The Romans come next, turning Egypt into a breadbasket for empire, and the old gods retreat into temple shadows, worshipped by fewer adherents each generation. Christianity spreads, renaming the old holidays, building churches atop temple foundations, declaring victory over pagan darkness. Islam arrives, bringing new architecture and new prayers, and the Black Lotus becomes, if it becomes anything at all, a footnote in apocryphal texts that medieval scholars copy without comprehension. But soil, you're learning, keeps better records than scribes. The ground where the Black Lotus first bloomed remains toxic in ways that defy modern environmental analysis. In 1884, when European archaeologists began their systematic excavation of Theban sites, a young British botanist named Edmund Hartley attempted to take soil samples from the old palace gardens for analysis. His goal was prosaic enough: determine what crops ancient Egyptians grew, what flowers they cultivated, build a comprehensive picture of palace horticulture during the New Kingdom. Hartley was methodical, scientific, thoroughly trained at Kew Gardens, everything a Victorian naturalist should be. He took his samples and returned to his tent to begin preliminary examination. That night, he wrote in his field journal, now housed in the British Museum's archives, catalogued but rarely examined, a single entry that reads, "The soil is not dead. I do not know how else to describe this. Under magnification, I see movement that cannot be explained by microbial activity. The particles themselves seem to remember. I am not sleeping well. I dream of a woman in Egyptian dress, weeping over a child's body. She looks at me as if she knows me, as if she has been waiting. The dreams feel more real than waking. I should return to Cairo. Hartley never returned to Cairo. He died 3 days later of what the expedition doctor diagnosed as sudden cardiac failure, etiology unknown. The soil samples were disposed of, the incident attributed to the hazards of field work in a challenging climate. But 2 other members of the expedition reported dreams identical to Hartley's. The grieving woman, the waiting, the sense of being recognized by something that should not know them. The site was abandoned shortly after, deemed archaeologically unpromising, despite being the location of a major New Kingdom palace. Modern scholars debate why the early excavators gave up so quickly on such a potentially significant site, some attributing it to funding issues, others to the comparative glamour of Valley of the King's discoveries, drawing resources elsewhere. You, standing in this liminal space between documented history and suppressed pattern, know the truth. Some sites repel investigation, not through explicit prohibition, but through accumulated unease. The quiet certainty that some questions should remain unanswered. The black lotus blooms still, though you will not find it mentioned in botanical surveys or archaeological reports. It grows in the cracks between acknowledged history, in the soil that official narratives prefer to leave unexamined, those who tend gardens near the old palace site, and there are a few stubborn locals who maintain small plots, despite the ground's reputation for refusing cultivation, occasionally report seeing black flowers at the edges of their vision, present when glimpsed peripherally, but absent when examined directly. They do not speak of this to outsiders, understanding instinctively that some phenomena exist in the space between observation and acknowledgement, thriving precisely because they remain officially unrecognized. Nefertari's grief has outlasted her name, her dynasty, her very civilization. The Egyptians who planted that first grief no longer exist as a continuous culture, their language dead, their gods dormant, their understanding of Mahat and the Duat lost to everyone except academics who can reconstruct the theory, but never the lived experience. Yet the black lotus persists, fed not by sun or soil, but by something more fundamental: the human capacity for grief, the refusal of loss to be forgotten, the way pain marks the world and leaves traces deeper than any monument. You stand now in the present moment, October 2025, looking at a patch of ground that guidebooks do not mention, that tour groups bypass in favor of more photogenic ruins. Nothing appears to grow here. The soil looks ordinary, dusty brown with occasional fragments of ancient pottery, the standard archaeological palimpsest. But if you wait until the moon rises, if you possess the particular misfortune to be carrying your own unresolved grief, you might see it. A single black flower, thorned and impossible, opening its petals to darkness. You might feel it too, the sudden weight of every loss you've ever experienced, compressed into a single crystalline moment of unbearable clarity. The black lotus does not offer comfort. It does not promise that pain fades or that time heals. It offers only this: your grief will be remembered, will mark the world, will bloom in dark corners long after your name has been forgotten. Whether this is curse or consolation depends entirely on what you believe about the purpose of suffering, about whether memory is gift or burden, about what should be allowed to grow from the soil of human loss. The dynasty fell, petal by petal, exactly as Nefertari promised. But the flower, the flower remembers everything. The wind moves across Thebes, carrying sand that once witnessed dynasties, that absorbed the tears of a woman whose name history chose not to preserve. Somewhere beneath that sand, roots continue their patient work, not growing, not exactly, but waiting. The black lotus does not need sun. It does not need water. It needs only grief, and grief, you've learned, is the one crop that never fails. The moon rises, the petals unfurl, and in the space between your heartbeat and the next, you understand. Some flowers bloom forever, fed by losses that refuse to die. The soil remembers, the thorns wait, and the darkness, when it blooms, blooms beautiful. You stand in the throne room of Amarna, where the air shimmers with heat that has nothing to do with the season, where the walls are covered in reliefs that make the priesthood of Thebes grind their teeth in impotent rage. The year is 1346 BCE, and you are watching a woman commit the most exquisite form of suicide ever conceived. She is declaring herself divine. Her name is Nefertiti. Yes, that Nefertiti. The beautiful one who has come, whose face will survive in limestone bust form to become the most recognizable profile in ancient history. But you are seeing her in a moment that the official records will carefully edit. A chapter that archaeologists will debate in hushed academic voices, uncertain whether to call it religious revolution or civilizational madness. She stands beside her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic king who abandoned the traditional pantheon for a single solar deity, the Aten, the sun disk itself, radiant and distant and conveniently unmediated by priests. It was supposed to be his revolution, his theological coup that would break the power of the Amun priesthood and consolidate divine authority directly in the royal family. But somewhere in the process of dismantling centuries of religious infrastructure, something shifted. Akhenaten, with his elongated skull and feminine hips, features so distinctive that scholars still debate whether he suffered from Marfan syndrome or whether the artistic style was purely symbolic, became increasingly withdrawn, lost in ecstatic visions and solar hymns. And Nefertiti, who was supposed to be merely his consort, his beautiful ornament, began to understand something dangerous. If divinity could be claimed rather than inherited, if godhood was a matter of declaration rather than bloodline, then why should it belong exclusively to her increasingly absent husband? The reliefs on these walls tell a story that makes traditional Egyptian iconography look positively restrained. In conventional temple art, pharaohs are shown receiving blessings from gods, interceding with divine powers on behalf of their people, maintaining Mayat through ritual observance. But here, in Amarna's experimental theology, you see Nefertiti standing in positions traditionally reserved for gods themselves. She performs solo rituals, something queens never did. She wears the double crown in scenes where Akhenaten is absent. Most shocking of all, she is depicted smiting enemies with a mace, the ultimate symbol of pharaonic power, an image that should be exclusively male, exclusively royal, exclusively divine. Some Egyptologists argue this represents a co-regency, that Nefertiti ruled alongside or perhaps even instead of Akhenaten during the final years of his reign. Others contend that the iconography is symbolic, that we're misreading artistic convention through modern assumptions about power and gender. But you, standing in this throne room where the temperature keeps rising despite the sun being hours from its zenith, know that the truth is simpler and more terrible. Nefertiti looked at the sun and decided it had no more right to worship than she did. The priests of Ra, the old solar deity whose cult predated Akhenaten's Aten by millennia, watch from Thebes with growing horror. Ra is not merely the sun. He is the principle of solar authority, the cosmic order that travels through the underworld each night and emerges victorious each dawn. To challenge Ra is to challenge the fundamental architecture of Egyptian cosmology. Yet here is Nefertiti, performing rituals at noon, Ra's hour, his moment of absolute power, and directing prayers not to the sun but to herself as its earthly manifestation. She has taken Akhenaten's monotheism and compressed it further, eliminating even the Aten as intermediary. If the sun is divine, she reasons with crystalline and catastrophic logic. And if pharaohs are divine, and if she performs the pharaoh's role, then she is the sun, the Aten made flesh, Ra reborn in feminine form. This is not humility dressed as piety. This is naked theological ambition, and it smells like ozone before lightning strikes. Her daughters, 6 of them, no sons, which is itself a kind of cosmic insult in a culture obsessed with patrilineal succession, are trained at this new doctrine. The youngest, Setepenre, barely 7 years old, can recite the heresies with perfect pronunciation. My mother is the sun's eye. She sees all. She judges all. She needs no intermediary, no priest, no god beyond herself. The child speaks these words with the casual confidence of someone reciting multiplication tables, unaware that each syllable is another shovel of dirt on the dynasty's grave. Children, after all, make excellent carriers of ideology. They believe what they're taught before they learn that some beliefs carry consequences. The historical record shows that Nefertiti vanished from official documentation around year 14 of Akhenaten's reign. Simply gone, as if erased by a careful editor going through the archives with chisel and malice. Some scholars suggest she died of plague. There was an epidemic during this period that killed at least one of her daughters. Others propose she was murdered in a palace coup, her body disposed of so thoroughly that no trace remains. A few fringe theorists, the ones mainstream academia treats with polite dismissal, suggest something stranger, that she adopted a new name, ruled briefly as the mysterious pharaoh Neferuaten, and then disappeared into mythology itself. But you are watching the moment before the vanishing, the precipice before the fall, and you can see what's coming. Nefertiti has ordered the construction of a new temple, smaller than the great Aten temples, but positioned with astronomical precision. It sits at a point where, on the summer solstice, the sun at its zenith casts no shadow, the one moment each year when Ra's light falls absolutely vertical, when the god looks directly down upon the earth. And at that spot, at that geometrically calculated position of solar attention, Nefertiti has placed not an altar to Ra or the Aten, but a mirror. A bronze mirror, polished to impossible smoothness by craftsmen who wept as they worked, understanding instinctively that they were creating an instrument of cosmic offense. The mirror is positioned to reflect the zenith sun back upward, to send Ra's own light back into his face, to say with geometrical precision, "I see you seeing me, and I am not afraid. I am your equal. I am your reflection. I am you." The priests in Thebes perform frantic counter-rituals, burning incense by the ton, sacrificing bulls in numbers that strain the temple economy, chanting protective formulas until their voices crack. But rituals work through established channels, through centuries of accumulated tradition and divine contracts carefully maintained. What do you do when someone simply steps outside the entire system? When someone refuses to acknowledge that the channels exist? When someone looks at the sun and says, "You have no power I don't grant you." The temperature in Amarna continues to rise. The Nile's flood that year is weak, the harvest poor. Children are born with strange deformities that physicians cannot explain. And Nefertiti stands before her mirror altar, waiting for the solstice, waiting for noon, waiting for the moment when she will challenge Ra to prove his divinity against hers. She does not wait long, gods, you see. Take theological insults personally. You move forward to the summer solstice, to the day when the sun reaches its apex and discovers something unprecedented. Defiance rendered in polished bronze. The morning begins ordinarily enough, the Nile reflecting golden light, the limestone cliffs of Amarna glowing pale as bone, the usual rhythms of a city going about its heretical business. But there's a tension in the air that animals recognize before humans do. The sacred cats that roam the palace complex have disappeared, seeking shelter in cool underground spaces. Birds fly in erratic patterns, as if the sky itself has become unreliable. Even the insects, usually droning their endless summer symphony, have gone silent. Nefertiti rises before dawn and performs ablutions that are part ritual, part theater, part genuine preparation for what she believes will be apotheosis. She anoints herself with oils infused with myrrh and frankincense, scents reserved for gods and the dead, which in Egyptian cosmology are often the same thing. She dresses in white linen so fine it's nearly transparent, and over it she places a collar of gold and lapis lazuli that weighs nearly 20 pounds. Each bead carved with symbols that are not quite hieroglyphs, not quite anything in the established religious vocabulary. Her crown, the flat-topped blue crown she's made her signature, sits on her head like a challenge to gravity itself. Her remaining daughters watch from the doorway, uncertain whether to be proud or terrified. 3 of the 6 are already dead. Fever, accident, the usual mortality that claims children even in royal households. Though whispers suggest the deaths coincided suspiciously with their mother's escalating blasphemies, the 3 survivors have learned a careful neutrality, the political skill of supporting their mother without fully endorsing her theology. Survival, after all, often requires strategic ambiguity about one's convictions. Akhenaten is absent. He's been absent increasingly often, retreating to private chambers where he composes hymns to the Atean and takes counsel from visions only he can see. Some historians suggest he was simply ill, that the physical peculiarities visible in his portraits indicate a wasting disease that affected his cognition. Others propose he withdrew deliberately recognizing that his wife's ambitions had surpassed his own and choosing passive observation over active opposition. You, watching him through the walls of his sanctuary, see a man who has realized too late that he opened a door he cannot close, that he taught his wife to question divine authority without teaching her where to stop. Nefertiti walks through the city toward her mirror temple, and people stop to watch. Not with the reverence pharaohs typically command, but with something closer to the attention given to natural disasters, the compulsion to witness what should not be witnessed, to see what happens when cosmic boundaries are violated. The procession is small, just Nefertiti, 3 priest attendants who look like they'd rather be anywhere else, and a single musician playing a drum whose rhythm sounds disturbingly like a heartbeat accelerating toward cardiac arrest. The temple itself is architecturally simple, a rectangular enclosure open to the sky. The bronze mirror mounted on a stone pedestal at the center, oriented with astronomical precision toward the zenith point. Around the enclosure's walls, reliefs show Nefertiti in progressive stages of divine transformation. First as queen, then as priestess, then as goddess, finally as the sun itself, her body dissolving into radiating light. The progression makes explicit what her actions have been implying. She intends not merely to challenge Ra, but to replace him, to become the solar deity herself through an act of cosmic usurpation. The fringe texts, those papyri that libraries catalog with embarrassment, that scholars cite only to dismiss, speak of a practice called Shai Shems W, destiny following, in which a mortal could theoretically ascend to divine status through perfect alignment of will, ritual, and cosmic timing. The mainstream priesthood dismissed this as dangerous fantasy, the theological equivalent of alchemy's promise to turn lead into gold. But certain heterodox traditions, particularly those influenced by Nubian and Mesopotamian practices, maintained that apotheosis was possible for those bold enough to attempt it and precise enough to execute it correctly. Nefertiti, who has spent years studying texts from across the known world, believes she has found the formula. As noon approaches, the temperature becomes actively oppressive. The air shimmers not with ordinary heat, but with something that makes vision unreliable, that turns straight lines into curves, that makes the sky look simultaneously too close and too far away. The 3 priest attendants begin the chant, a formula Nefertiti herself composed, mixing Egyptian, Akkadian, and Nubian syllables into something that sounds like language having a nervous breakdown. The drum continues its accelerating rhythm, and Nefertiti stands before her mirror, watching the sun climb toward its zenith, preparing to meet her god as an equal. The priests of Ra in Thebes, 300 miles south, feel it the moment noon arrives in Amarna. The great temple of Karnak experiences what can only be described as a sympathetic seizure. Torches that shouldn't be able to extinguish in still air suddenly go dark. Stone walls that have stood for centuries develop hairline cracks, and the massive statue of Ra in the inner sanctuary turns its head. Not metaphorically, not as symbolic interpretation, but actually turns its head, the limestone neck rotating with sounds like grinding continents, until the god's painted eyes look north toward Amarna with an expression that transcends anger into something colder and more final. Back in Amarna, the moment of zenith arrives. The sun hangs directly overhead, casting virtually no shadows, its light falling like judgment. And Nefertiti's mirror catches that light and sends it back, a beam of reflected solar fire aimed directly at Ra's celestial position. For one eternal second, nothing happens. The light goes up. The drum reaches its crescendo. Nefertiti's arms spread wide in posture of reception or defiance or both, and the world holds its breath. Then the sun responds, not with the gentle warmth of a deity accepting worship, but with focused fury. The light intensifies, concentrating on the mirror like divine attention compressed into a single point of heat. The bronze begins to glow, first red, then orange, then white hot, and still Nefertiti stands her ground. Still she stares upward into the light that should blind any mortal eye. Still she speaks her formula of apotheosis. I am the eye that sees the eye. I am the light that illuminates light. I am Ra's daughter, Ra's equal, Ra's successor. Accept me or be proven powerless. The mirror melts, not gradually, but instantly, the bronze liquefying and pouring off the stone pedestal like metallic water. And where the molten bronze touches the ground, it doesn't cool. It burns down, eating through limestone, through the foundation, through bedrock itself, creating a hole that seems to extend beyond mere physical depth into somewhere that geometry cannot properly describe. Nefertiti doesn't step back, doesn't flinch. She stands at the edge of that impossible hole, looking down into darkness that flickers with heat that has no visible source. And she laughs. Not madness, or not entirely madness. It's the laugh of someone who has finally gotten the god's attention, who has forced the divine to acknowledge her existence, even if that acknowledgement comes in the form of annihilation. Come then, she says to the sun, to Ra, to the principle of solar authority that has ruled unchallenged since before human memory began. Come down and prove you're more than light and heat. Prove you're conscious. Prove you can be challenged. Prove I'm wrong. The sky darkens, not with clouds. There are no clouds, but as if the light itself is being drained away, pulled back toward its source. The sun gathering its strength for a response that will be heard not just in Amarna, but in the cosmic spheres where gods conduct their politics. The three priest attendants flee, abandoning their posts, their training, their commitment to witness whatever happens. The musician drops his drum and runs. Even Nefertiti's daughters, watching from the palace, turn away, unable to watch their mother's final moment. Only Nefertiti remains, standing at the edge of that burning hole, waiting for the sun god to descend and answer her challenge with something more than reflected light and melted bronze. She doesn't have to wait long. Gods, when truly offended, are terrifyingly prompt. You witness the moment when theology becomes physics, when metaphor crystallizes into unbearable literalism. The sun, Ra, the Aten, the cosmic principle that has no name because names imply limitation, begins its descent. Not metaphorically, not as priestly interpretation or symbolic vision, but as actual movement that violates every astronomical principle the ancient world understands. The solar disk lowers toward the horizon, though it's barely past noon, the light becoming concentrated, focused, as if the diffuse radiance that normally bathes the entire earth is gathering itself into a single beam aimed at one blasphemous woman standing in a melted temple in the city of the horizon. The effect on Amarna is immediate and catastrophic. Crops in the fields wither as the light withdraws from them, their leaves curling and blackening as if autumn has arrived in seconds. The Nile, that reliable artery of civilization, begins to steam where sunlight no longer touches it, the water temperature dropping so rapidly that fish float to the surface in silver masses of confusion. People who were going about their daily business, baking bread, weaving linen, arguing over market prices, stop mid-motion and look up at the sky with expressions of primal recognition. The ancestral understanding that something has gone cosmically wrong, that the contract between heaven and earth is being renegotiated in real time, and they are not part of the negotiation. Nefertiti watches the sun descend and feels something she hasn't felt in years. Doubt, not regret. She's too committed for that. Has traveled too far down this road to turn back now. But the sudden vertigo of realizing that theoretical blasphemy and practical blasphemy occupy very different territories. It's one thing to declare yourself equal to the gods in throne room rhetoric. Quite another to watch those gods actually respond. Still, she holds her position at the edge of the burning hole, her white linen now plastered to her skin with sweat that evaporates almost instantly in the intensifying heat, her gold collar growing uncomfortably warm, her crown, that proud blue crown, beginning to smoke faintly at its edges. The historical record, such as it survives, becomes deeply peculiar at this point. Multiple sources, temple inscriptions, papyrus fragments. Even a damaged stela discovered in 1932 reference the day the sun fell on Amarna or the moment Ra answered blasphemy. Mainstream Egyptologists interpret these as references to a solar eclipse, perhaps total, that coincided, unfortunately, with Nefertiti's solstice ritual. Solar eclipses were considered profoundly unlucky in Egyptian cosmology, interpreted as the serpent Apophis temporarily devouring Ra during his celestial journey. An eclipse at the moment of Nefertiti's challenge would have seemed like divine commentary, the gods quite literally darkening the sky in disapproval. But eclipses don't last hours. They don't cause the temperature to rise rather than fall, and they certainly don't leave physical traces in limestone that resemble burn patterns, which is exactly what archaeologists found when they excavated the Amarna site in the early 20th century. A circular area of approximately 30 meters in diameter where the stone shows evidence of exposure to extreme heat, temperatures that shouldn't be achievable without industrial equipment. The official explanation involves a fire, probably during the systematic destruction of Amarna that occurred after Akhenaten's death, when his successors tried to erase all evidence of the heresy. But fires burn upward and outward. They don't create perfectly circular zones of thermal damage with the intensity greatest at the center. Nefertiti feels the heat intensify beyond any natural measure. The air itself becomes difficult to breathe, each inhalation like swallowing embers. Her skin begins to glow, not metaphorically, not as poetic description, but actually glow. As if she's becoming translucent, as if the light is no longer just falling on her, but passing through her, illuminating her from within. She looks down at her hands and sees her bones visible through flesh that seems suddenly thin as papyrus, sees the gold rings on her fingers beginning to soften and lose their shape. This is the moment when most mortals would break, would fall to their knees and beg forgiveness, would offer any sacrifice to make the divine attention turn away. But remember what was established at the beginning. Nefertiti didn't challenge Ra out of madness or ignorance. She challenged him because she genuinely believed herself capable of divine status, because she looked at the theological infrastructure of her civilization and decided it was negotiable. Pride of that magnitude doesn't collapse easily. It either achieves apotheosis or burns itself out trying. "I do not kneel," she says, and her voice sounds strange now, layered with harmonics like multiple throats speaking simultaneously. "I am not your subject, Ra. I am your reflection. I am what you would be if you took flesh and walked among mortals. Destroy me, and you destroy the only being who ever understood your loneliness." The occult texts, those grimoires and hermetic treatises that reference Egyptian practices through multiple filters of translation and medieval reinterpretation, speak of something called the solar marriage, a ritual in which the practitioner attempts to merge consciousness with the sun itself, to achieve union with the divine fire through perfect alignment of will and cosmic timing. The practice was supposedly attempted by various pharaohs and high priests throughout Egyptian history, always failing, always ending in death or madness or both. The theoretical goal was to become a transfigured spirit, who could move between mortal and divine realms at will. But theory, as always, proves simpler than practice. The light contracts further, becoming a pillar of fire extending from the lowered sun to the spot where Nefertiti stands. Inside that pillar, inside that concentrated divine attention, something begins to happen. Nefertiti's form becomes difficult to perceive clearly. She's simultaneously there and not there, solid and transparent, screaming and laughing and silent all at once. The burning hole at her feet expands, and from its depths comes a sound like worlds grinding together, like the machinery of cosmic order adjusting itself to accommodate an anomaly it was never designed to process. The people of Amarna, those who haven't fled entirely, watch from whatever shelter they can find. They will later report, in testimony that priests try desperately to suppress, that they saw their queen dissolve into light, that they watched her body come apart like morning mist under noon sun, that in the moment before she vanished entirely, she seemed to grow larger, to expand until she filled the pillar of fire, to become something that was neither fully human nor fully divine, but caught between, suspended in that terrible space where transformation is incomplete. Then, with a sound like thunder arriving before the lightning, the pillar collapses inward. The light releases its concentration and returns to its normal diffuse radiance. The sun resumes its proper position, or at least a position close enough to proper that most observers convince themselves nothing astronomically impossible occurred. The temperature drops back toward merely oppressive rather than apocalyptic, and where Nefertiti stood, where the mirror temple was, where the burning hole extended into impossible depths, there is only smooth limestone, slightly discolored, slightly warm to the touch, but otherwise unremarkable. No body, no bones, no crown or collar or rings or any evidence that a queen of Egypt stood in that spot moments ago. Just stone that shows signs of having been heated, and a faint scent in the air that combines myrrh with something chemical, something burnt, something that smells like lightning smells after it strikes. The official record, written by the priests who would restore traditional religion after Akhenaten's death, states simply, "The great royal wife Nefertiti departed to the west in her 14th year." Departed to the west, the euphemism for death, for joining the realm of Osiris, for becoming part of the orderly Egyptian afterlife. It's the same phrase they use for everyone, from pharaohs to farmers. The standardized language that smooths over individual circumstances in favor of cosmic continuity. But the people of Amarna, those who witnessed the event, develop a different phrase. They speak of those who walked into the sun's eye, those who challenged divine authority so completely that the gods had no choice but to respond directly. The phrase becomes a kind of cautionary tale, a warning against theological ambition that exceeds mortal bounds. Within a generation, Amarna is abandoned entirely, its buildings systematically dismantled, its very existence treated as embarrassing episode best forgotten. Yet certain things persist despite official erasure. For centuries after Nefertiti's vanishing, there are reports, dismissed as legend, attributed to mass delusion or misidentified natural phenomena, of a figure seen in the desert at noon on summer solstice. A woman wearing a blue crown, her body flickering like heat shimmer, neither fully present nor fully absent, walking through ruins that no longer exist except in memory. She speaks to no one, acknowledges no observers, simply walks the path from where the palace stood to where the mirror temple burned, over and over, eternally attempting to complete a ritual that was interrupted by divine intervention. Some say she succeeded in her apotheosis, but, at incomplete level, that she exists now in the liminal space between mortal and divine, neither fully one nor the other, conscious but trapped, eternal but powerless. Others claim she failed entirely, that what observers see is merely afterimage, the visual echo of an event so cosmically significant that it burned itself into reality like a photograph permanently exposed. The scholarly consensus, such as it exists, is that these sightings are simple folklore, the human tendency to create ghost stories around unexplained historical events. But you, standing now in the ruins of Amarna where tourists take photographs and guides recite sanitized histories, you feel it, the faint warmth in the stone where the mirror temple stood, the way the air shimmers slightly different at noon on certain days, the sense that something happened here that the official narratives cannot quite contain. The challenge was issued, the god responded, and in that moment of cosmic collision, a queen either achieved divinity or destroyed herself trying, and the distinction between those outcomes, you're beginning to understand, may be far less clear than theology prefers to admit. Ra continues his daily journey, rising and setting with reliable regularity, maintaining cosmic order as he has for millennia. But if you look carefully at high noon, if you know what to watch for, you might see it. A slight flicker in the light, a momentary hesitation, as if the sun is checking over its shoulder. As if even gods remember the mortal who dared to claim equality and forced heaven itself to prove otherwise. At noon, the sand grows too hot to touch, and the ruins cast shadows that fall at angles slightly wrong for the sun's true position. The local guides avoid certain spots without quite knowing why, stepping around invisible boundaries their grandparents warned them about. And when the wind blows from the east, carrying desert dust and ancient heat, you can almost smell it. Myrrh and lightning and bronze melted beyond recovery. The sky remains empty of all but light. The stone holds its secrets, and somewhere in the space between presence and absence, between memory and matter, a blue crown flickers like candle flame. Neither extinguished nor truly burning, eternally caught in the moment before transformation completes or fails. The sun moves on, the earth turns, but certain challenges once issued echo forever in the silence between heartbeats and prayer. You stand at the edge of the western desert, where the Nile's green mercy ends and the dominion of Set begins, where the sand stretches toward infinity with the patience of something that has already won every argument about permanence. The year is 525 BCE, and you are watching an army prepare to march into oblivion with the disciplined precision of men who believe their orders still matter. They are the Medjay, the elite desert scouts who served Egypt's pharaohs for over 1,000 years. Nubian warriors whose skill at navigating the trackless waste made them invaluable, whose loyalty was purchased with gold and sealed with oaths that meant something before the Persians came and rendered all such contracts obsolete. Their commander is named Khenti, a man whose face bears the ritual scars of his tribe and the deeper scars of watching his world collapse. Cambyses II of Persia has conquered Egypt with the casual efficiency of someone collecting provinces, has declared himself pharaoh with all the legitimacy that military victory provides, and has ordered the temples of Amun destroyed, not merely closed or repurposed, but destroyed, erased, their priesthood scattered like grain before wind. The Medjay, who served not Persia but the principle of Egyptian sovereignty itself, find themselves obsolete, their oaths binding them to a political entity that no longer exists. Unemployment, you see, takes on existential dimensions when your entire identity is built on service to something that has been administratively discontinued. But Khenti has received one final order, passed secretly through the network of priests fleeing Cambyses' purges. Escort a sacred artifact to the Oracle of Siwa, 500 miles west through the most hostile terrain in the known world. The artifact itself is never named in surviving texts. Some scholars suggest it was a statue of Amun. Others propose it was treasury gold meant to fund resistance. Still others maintain it was something far stranger, something the priests themselves feared to keep near civilization. The apocryphal Book of Hidden Marches, a text known only through medieval Arab references, claims it was the heart of the first pharaoh, a relic that predated even the Old Kingdom, something so sacred that its very existence was considered state secret. 500 men volunteer for this mission. 500 warriors who understand that the Egypt they served has died, but refuse to acknowledge that their service can die with it. They gather at the edge of cultivation, where the last date palms cast shadows like prison bars, and they swear an oath that makes the desert itself pause to listen. We will complete this march. We will deliver what was entrusted. We will not stop, not for storm, not for thirst, not for death itself. We march for Egypt eternal, not Egypt temporal. We march for the principle, not the king. Oaths, you're learning, should come with warning labels about unintended longevity. They march west as the sun sets, 500 men and 50 camels, carrying water skins and dried dates and a sealed chest that takes 4 men to lift. Its weight suggesting either gold or something denser than gold. Something that makes the sand beneath it compact strangely, as if the earth is trying to avoid contact. Khenti leads from the front, consulting stars that the Medjay have used for navigation since before the pyramids were dreams in architects' minds. The western desert is not empty. It's populated by the bones of previous expeditions, by the ruins of outposts abandoned when the trade routes shifted, by the peculiar silence that accumulates in places where human ambition regularly comes to die. But the Medjay know this terrain, have crossed it countless times in service to pharaohs whose names are now carved in temple walls. They move with confidence, with purpose, with the terrible certainty of men who have found meaning in the absence of hope. On the 3rd day, the sandstorm arrives. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of warning signs, but as sudden as divine attention, the sky turning brown-black in minutes, the wind rising to speeds that strip skin and scour bronze, the sand itself becoming airborne in quantities that transform atmosphere into solid matter. The Medjay do what they've been trained to do: cluster together, cover faces, anchor supplies, wait for the storm to exhaust itself. Desert storms, after all, are fierce but brief, the tantrums of landscape that passes quickly. Except this one doesn't pass. It continues for 3 days, or what they assume is 3 days, though in the perpetual twilight of suspended sand, time becomes negotiable. When the wind finally dies and visibility returns, the Medjay discover something that should be impossible. They are precisely where they started. Not lost, not turned around, but returned to the exact spot at the desert's edge where they began their march. They can see their own footprints from days ago, still visible despite the storm, as if the sand has been maintaining a record, as if something is keeping score. Khenti, who has led men through situations that would make lesser commanders weep, makes a decision that future scholars will debate as either tactically brilliant or spiritually catastrophic. He orders them to march again. Same direction, same formation, same purpose. The desert tests us, he tells his men. We prove ourselves through repetition. The Medjay, trained to obey and culturally conditioned to view persistence as virtue, comply without protest. They march west again, following stars that should guide them toward Siwa, but somehow guide them in circles instead. Some say the storm was natural coincidence, that disorientation in featureless terrain is common, that the Medjay simply lost their way and were too proud to admit navigational failure. Others propose that Cambyses, learning of their mission, sent Persian troops to intercept them, that the army was destroyed, and the story of their endless march is merely legend grown from the trauma of conquest. But you, standing in this liminal space between documented history and persistent rumor, know what the mainstream explanations carefully avoid. The Medjay swore an oath to complete their march, and the desert, ancient, patient, and literal-minded in the way that elemental forces tend to be, accepted that oath at face value. They will march. They will continue. They will not stop for death. And the desert, in its infinite capacity for granting wishes in the most terrible way possible, has ensured they never do. You move forward through centuries that flow like sand through an hourglass that no one remembers to turn, watching the Medjay march and march and march again through a desert that has become their eternal present tense. The stars wheel overhead but never advance. Always the same configuration, always the precise celestial map that Kenti studied on that first night when he believed navigation mattered, when he thought knowing the stars' names would guide them somewhere other than back to their own beginning. The moon rises and sets but maintains the same phase, caught in repetition like everything else in this pocket of frozen time where cause and effect have agreed to take a permanent holiday. The men change slowly, incrementally, in ways they don't initially notice. Their water skins empty and refill overnight, though no one can remember filling them. A mercy, perhaps, or a mockery, the desert ensuring they remain hydrated enough to continue their eternal assignment. Their dried dates never diminish, no matter how many they consume, the supply mysteriously constant, suggesting someone or something has a vested interest in maintaining this march indefinitely. Their bodies don't age in conventional ways, don't accumulate the wear that desert travel should inflict, yet they don't feel alive either. They exist in suspended animation, biological processes continuing out of habit rather than necessity. Time passes in the world beyond this cursed tract of sand. The Persian Empire falls to Alexander, who himself attempts to reach the oracle of Siwa and nearly dies in the attempt. His army, comprised of Macedonians who know nothing of desert survival, is saved by miraculous rain and the sudden appearance of crows that guide them to water. Some historians tribute this to luck, others to divine intervention from Zeus Ammon, whose oracle Alexander seeks to consult. But the fringe accounts, those recorded by Alexander's generals in their later years, when wine and nostalgia made them candid, speak of something stranger, that as they wandered lost, they heard footsteps in the dunes, hundreds of footsteps marching in perfect formation. And when they followed that sound, they found the path to Siwa. Alexander himself reportedly said, "We were guided by an army that wasn't there," though his official chroniclers edited this statement into something more acceptably rational. The Medjay, meanwhile, continue their circuit. 500 men marching in formation that never breaks, carrying a chest they can no longer remember opening, following orders issued by a political entity that dissolved 5 centuries ago. They speak to each other. They haven't lost language, haven't descended into mindless automation. But their conversations have become recursive, circular, repeating the same observations about stars that don't move, sand that looks identical in every direction, the growing suspicion that something has gone cosmically wrong but lacks vocabulary to articulate what or how. Kenti, still leading from the front, still consulting stars that lie to him, has developed a theory. He shares it one night, or what passes for night in this eternal twilight, where darkness never quite arrives, while the men rest in formation, sitting in sand that feels slightly wrong, slightly more solid than sand should be, as if it's becoming something else, as if the desert is slowly petrifying everything it touches. "We swore an oath," Kenti says, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been marching for longer than human memory should accommodate. "We swore to complete the march. But perhaps we defined completion incorrectly. Perhaps the march is not completed by arrival, but by the marching itself. Perhaps we are not meant to reach Siwa, but to eternally travel toward it, to embody persistence as principle rather than achieve persistence as goal. This is either profound philosophical insight or advanced rationalization of inescapable circumstance. The distinction between the two often comes down to whether the philosophy produces useful results, and in this case, usefulness is debatable. One of the younger soldiers, though younger is increasingly meaningless when no one ages, asks the question that everyone has been avoiding. Can we stop? Can we choose to end this? The silence that follows is not contemplative, but terrified. The collective realization that they might lack the agency to quit, that their oath has become a kind of metaphysical prison, that free will is surprisingly easy to surrender and impossibly difficult to reclaim. They try, of course, on what might be their 1,000th repetition or their 10,000th. They've long since lost count, and counting feels increasingly arbitrary. A group of 50 men simply stops walking. They sit down in the sand and refuse to rise, a strike against cosmic employment conditions. For 3 hours, they remain seated while the rest of the column continues forward. Then the wind rises. Not a storm this time, just persistent pressure, gentle but inexorable, and the seated men find themselves sliding across the sand as if the desert itself is dragging them, moving them forward to catch up with their formation, whether they cooperate or not. By nightfall, they're back in position, marching in step, their attempted rebellion absorbed and neutralized by forces that don't negotiate. The artifact they carry, that sealed chest that started this entire catastrophe, begins to change. Or perhaps it was always changing and they're only now noticing, their perception adapting to timescales where transformation becomes visible. The wood darkens. The bronze bindings develop patina that shouldn't form in desert dryness. And sometimes, when the wind is still and the sound of marching feet momentarily subsides, they can hear something inside the chest. Not movement, nothing so prosaic as an object shifting, but something closer to breathing, to heartbeat, to the rhythmic pulse of something that maintains life through sheer refusal to acknowledge death as option. Some scholars who study the mystery of the lost army, and it is studied, has been studied for 2 millennia, generates academic papers and documentary programs with pleasing regularity, propose that the Medjay simply died of natural causes. Dehydration, exposure, the usual killers that claim desert travelers who misjudge their supplies or their route. The fact that no bodies have ever been found is attributed to sand burial, to the desert's efficiency at concealing evidence, to the sheer vastness of the search area making discovery statistically improbable. These are comfortable explanations, rational explanations, explanations that allow scholars to file the mystery under solved probably, and move on to more tractable historical questions. But the Bedouin tribes who traverse the western desert, who know its moods and its malice with inherited intimacy, maintain different knowledge. They speak of the Jaish al-Da'im, the eternal army, and they know better than to camp in certain areas where the sand shows signs of persistent disturbance, where footprints appear overnight in patterns too regular to be wind-formed, where the air carries sounds of bronze on leather and the rhythmic crunch of 500 men walking in formation. The Bedouin don't mock this as superstition. They incorporate it into practical navigation, using the zones where the cursed army walks as landmarks, as boundaries that define safe routes by process of elimination. Remember the oath that started this. We will not stop, not for storm, not for thirst, not for death itself. The desert heard, the stars witnessed, and somewhere in the machinery of cosmic justice or cosmic indifference, the two being often functionally identical, that oath was accepted, ratified, made binding in ways that transcend merely human authority. The Medjay march because they swore they would march. They continue because continuation was the promise. And the desert, patient and literal as only elemental forces can be, holds them to their word with the implacable courtesy of a contract enforcer who never sleeps. You arrive at the present moment, standing in the western desert, where GPS satellites provide coordinates, but cannot explain why certain areas produce consistent navigation errors, why compasses spin uselessly, why the most sophisticated equipment modern technology offers suddenly reverts to the reliability of ancient superstition. The year is 2025, and you are part of an archaeological expedition that doesn't officially exist, funded by a European university that prefers not to be named, searching for evidence of Cambyses' lost army, those 50,000 Persian soldiers who allegedly vanished in a sandstorm while marching to destroy the Oracle of Siwa. It's a respectable cover story, academically legitimate, the kind of project that attracts grant funding and media interest. But you know what you're really searching for? What the expedition leader whispered after 3 glasses of wine in a Cairo hotel. The Medjay, the oath-bound, the ones who march eternal beneath stars that refuse to move forward. The evidence has been accumulating for decades, carefully suppressed, meticulously explained away, but persistent in the manner of truths that refuse convenient burial. In 1977, a geological survey team reported anomalous seismic readings in a specific tract of desert. Rhythmic vibrations occurring at precisely measured intervals, too regular to be natural, too deep to be surface phenomena. The official report attributed this to underground water flow, to shifting sand creating friction harmonics, to equipment malfunction. The unofficial notes, discovered later in a team member's personal effects, describe something else. The sand is remembering footsteps. The earth is keeping time with something that walks above it. In 1998, a satellite thermal imaging project mapping desert temperature variations found a corridor approximately 2 miles long, where heat signatures pulsed in patterns suggesting organized movement. Hundreds of heat sources traveling in formation, visible only in specific spectral ranges, appearing exclusively during certain lunar phases. The data was classified, then declassified, then reclassified when someone noticed that the formation matched historical descriptions of Medjay military columns, right down to the spacing between ranks and the positioning of supply camels. Science, it turns out, is remarkably good at pretending not to see what threatens its foundational assumptions. Your expedition camps at the edge of the anomaly zone, and immediately things feel wrong in ways that instruments cannot measure, but bodies recognize instinctively. The air pressure fluctuates without corresponding weather changes. Watches run backward for brief periods, then correct themselves. Dreams become communal. Multiple team members wake reporting identical nightmares of marching through darkness toward destinations that recede with every step. The expedition leader, Dr. Sarah Kemeny, maintains scientific composure while privately acknowledging that perhaps some mysteries prefer remaining mysterious, that perhaps certain historical events create ongoing effects that academic frameworks cannot adequately contain. On the third night, you hear them. Not metaphorically, not as auditory hallucination or misidentified wind, but clearly, unmistakably, footsteps. Hundreds of footsteps moving in synchronized rhythm, the sound of leather on sand, the creak of bronze armor, the low murmur of men speaking languages dead for millennia. You follow the sound, against better judgment, against Dr. Kemeny's explicit orders, against every survival instinct that warns you some invitations should be declined. And you find them. The Medjay march past you in the moonlight, translucent but not transparent, present but not entirely solid, occupying that ambiguous territory between memory and matter. They are exactly as described in texts you thought were mythology. 500 warriors in formation, Nubian faces marked with ritual scars, bronze weapons that catch light in ways modern metals don't, and at the center of the column, that chest, still carried by 4 men, still sealed, still pulsing with rhythm that might be heartbeat or might be countdown. They don't acknowledge your presence. They're locked in their eternal circuit, perceiving only what existed when their curse began, blind to the 25 centuries that have elapsed since they swore their impossible oath. But Kenti sees you, the commander, still at the column's head, still consulting stars that lie, turns his head as he passes, and his eyes meet yours with recognition that transcends temporal distance. He doesn't speak. His mouth moves, but no sound emerges. Or perhaps sound emerges in frequencies your ears cannot process. Words spoken in a language that predates the alphabets you know. But his expression communicates perfectly. Exhaustion, resignation, and something that might be plea or might be warning. He gestures to the chest his men carry, then to the stars, then back to you, and the meaning is clear enough. We are bound. We cannot stop. Someone must speak our names. Someone must release the oath, the fringe texts, those manuscripts that libraries catalog with embarrassment. Reference a concept called Shem Ankh, name life. The Egyptian belief that speaking the name of the dead sustains their existence in the afterlife, but that forgetting names condemns them to true death, to dissolution into the cosmic nothing. The Medjay have been forgotten. Their names were never recorded in official histories, never carved in temple walls, never preserved in the neat columns of hieroglyphic accounting that Egypt loved so dearly. They exist in limbo, sustained by their oath, but unable to complete it, trapped in the mechanical repetition of service to a purpose whose original meaning has evaporated like water in desert heat. You watch them march past, watch the column complete its circuit and return to its starting point. Watch Kenti consult the same lying stars and lead his men forward again into the same pointless distance. And you understand what the desert has done. It has granted them exactly what they requested: continuation, persistence, the inability to stop for death, while withholding the one thing that would make such continuation meaningful. They march, yes, eternally, but toward nothing, achieving nothing, serving nothing except the abstract principle of service itself. It is perhaps the most elegant curse ever devised. Not punishment through suffering, but through the grotesque fulfillment of desire stripped of purpose. Dr. Seer, Kemeny finds you at dawn, standing in sand that shows no footprints despite what you witnessed, holding a bronze arrowhead that you don't remember picking up, but that somehow found its way into your hand. She doesn't ask what you saw. She knows, has known since before the expedition began, has been collecting evidence of the eternal march for 15 years while maintaining the academic facade that such research requires. "We can't help them," she says quietly. "We don't know their names. We don't have their roster, their service records, any documentation that would let us speak them into rest. They're forgotten, and forgetting is the one curse that has no counterspell. But you're thinking about the chest, about the artifact they carry, about the way it pulses with rhythm that sounds like countdown. Perhaps the curse isn't meant to last forever. Perhaps it's meant to last until the artifact reaches its destination, until Siwa finally receives what was meant for its oracle, until the mission is completed in some form the original participants wouldn't recognize. Time, after all, has different meanings in deserts that refuse normal causality, in places where stars don't move and oaths don't expire. You return to Cairo with the expedition, write the required reports that mention nothing anomalous. Accept the academic consensus that Cambyses's lost army died of natural causes, and the Medjay were simply another casualty of political transition. But you keep the bronze arrowhead, and sometimes late at night when sleep won't come, you hear them. Footsteps in rhythm, the eternal march. 500 soldiers walking toward completion that perpetually recedes, serving an Egypt that exists now only in the geometry of their formation and the discipline of their stride. The desert keeps its own time. The stars maintain their lie. And somewhere in the space between documented history and persistent truth, the Medjay march forward, backward, eternally, waiting for someone to remember their names or for the sand itself to finally grow tired of keeping score. The wind shifts at midnight, carrying sounds that might be footsteps or might be sand moving in patterns too regular for comfort. The stars wheel overhead in configurations that astronomers swear are impossible, that cameras somehow fail to capture. And in the western desert, where GPS fails and compasses lie, the sand holds impressions that appear at dawn and vanish by noon. 500 sets of footprints, always fresh, always heading west, always returning to where they began. Bedouin caravans detour around certain dunes without explaining why. Archaeologists find bronze fragments they cannot date, and the oath, sworn 25 centuries ago to a kingdom that no longer exists, continues its patient work. March, return, repeat. The desert remembers everything. The stars bear witness. And somewhere in the machinery of cosmic justice, a counter ticks backward toward zero, measuring time in footsteps that never stop, never fade, never find the rest that only forgotten names can claim.